We'd like to welcome everyone here to Emmanuel Synagogue. We are so grateful to have you all with us tonight, and an especially warm welcome to Nikki Maor, who I've known for many, many years, although both of us are too young to know each other for many, many years. But it's a privilege and a joy to have you back in Sydney and here with us tonight. Before we begin the formal proceedings, I'd like to just acknowledge the traditional landowners. We acknowledge the traditional owners of this land, the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation. We walk with respect on the land that sustains the spirit of our First Nations and pray that together we can heal the wounds of past wrongs. May we learn the truth of our intertwined history, empower our First Nations voice within the Constitution, and strive to share equitably in the bounties of the nation we share. We walk together towards the future. We say Amen. I'm going to invite David Knoll to make the official welcome to Nikki.
Well, less than a month ago, the Israeli Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling to embrace the diversity of the Jewish people. In fact, that was some of the language used by one of the justices. Conversions outside the auspices of Israel's ultra-Orthodox religious authority are now acceptable for immigration status. For the first time, modern Orthodox, Masorti and progressive converts who converted to Judaism in Israel can become Israeli citizens. Signifying the issue's importance, a full plenum of judges heard a combined petition against, wait for it, the Interior Ministry, the Population Registry, the Conversion Authority in the Prime Minister's Office, and the Immigration Authority. The ruling included pages of refutations against the state's refusal to recognise as Jewish the 4 individuals who converted to Judaism outside the auspices of the chief rabbinate. It's not just those 4 people that the decision benefited. Appearing in the Supreme Court for the Reform and Masorti movements was none other than Nikki Maor, who is with us tonight. A person I'm honoured to call a friend, made Aliyah in 1989, lived on Kibbutz Lotan for 6 years, where I had probably the worst schnitzel I've ever had in my life, where she met and married her husband Benji, who I'm pleased to have met and known when they were back here for a shlichut. And after moving to Tel Aviv, she began her miraculous work at Iraq. And you will hear tonight why I use the word miraculous. She is now director of the Centres for Legal Aid for Olim, which is part of Iraq. And tonight we'll have a conversation about her trailblazing work, which is supported by the UIA Progressive Appeal. Nikki, for those who don't know you as well as I do, tell them a little bit about your journey to Israel and to joining IRAC.
Well, my journey started, I guess it could start when I was born, really, I guess, when I was born to parents who were immigrants from Europe and felt that keeping Judaism alive was something important and forced me to go to Hebrew school, and then forced me to have my bat mitzvah. And then I think they've regretted it ever since. But basically, since that time, I became involved in Netzer, and as the Reform Zionist Youth Movement, its highest goals were to, if you're going to make Aliyah, but even if you're not going to make Aliyah, to make the place you're living a better place, to work towards Tikkun Olam, to work towards tzedek chavrati, social justice. And it was clear to me that wherever I go to live, my aim would be to try and make the place I'm living a better place. I tried to do that on Kibbutz Lotan, but climbing date trees made me get very high in the sky, but didn't actually let me help too many people. And as it's at that time, the head of the kibbutz movement of Lotan said to me, listen, you're climbing high in the sky, but let's get yourself doing something useful for a change. And so I worked towards to change my law degree from Australia to Israel, so that I could try and do something useful in Israel. And then I realized when I tried to change my law degree from Australia to Israel, that although I spoke Hebrew fluently, I couldn't actually write anything in Hebrew. And when I spoke with the judge and I said, can I work with you doing to transfer my law degree? I had to do a year of working as a legal assistant. He said, well, I want you to write, to transcribe a judgment. At that time, this was in 1990, there weren't computers. So I had to write it. And he looked at me and said, but you don't know how to write. If you can't write in Hebrew, you'll never be able to be a lawyer in Israel. And as I picked up my pieces from the floor and went home, I said, well, either I'm going to stay in Israel and learn how to write Hebrew, or I'm going to go home. And I decided that I would, first of all, learn how to write Hebrew so that I could act as a lawyer in Israel. And secondly, would try and see if I could use the skills that I had to help new immigrants not have to pick up the pieces from the floor, and try and help their immigration into Israel. And it was just terribly lucky that at that time, we were talking about 1990, 1991, was the massive immigration from the former Soviet Union and from Ethiopia. And Israel was absorbing hundreds of thousands of new immigrants per day, and the Reform movement felt that the role that it could take in absorbing and helping absorbing these immigrants was to start a legal aid center to give these immigrants legal aid for coping with Israeli society. And that there were quite a few issues, which we'll talk about, that the new immigrants had to deal with. And so it just happened to be a fantastic click. The Uri Regev, who was the head of IREC at the time, said to me, this is the job that you're going to take on. And that was in 1991, 1992. And I've been there ever since.
And you can tell the story of some of the people that there would no doubt be some real memorable people who've come in and just appreciated the help.
Well, I've helped over 100,000 people. So I can't remember all of them.
Sure.
So maybe just a couple of recent ones, because I think one of the more memorable ones recently was a man who made Aliyah from Ethiopia. And when he made Aliyah, he thought that his children from his first marriage had died because he went into the army. As in Ethiopia, many of the men were taken into the army and separated from their families. And when he made Aliyah, he thought that his children were dead. And a couple of years after he arrived, he discovered that one of his children was still alive and was 8 years old. But the Interior Ministry said, well, you've been separated from your child for too long. And he himself converted to Judaism when he was in Israel. So he'd married a Jewish woman in Ethiopia, and he'd converted in Israel, so his child wasn't Jewish. And they said, your child can't come into the country. First of all, we're not even convinced that he's your child. And even if he were your child, you've been separated for too long. And we took on that case. The child was 8 when we took the case on. And by the time we won the case, the child was 18.
Wow.
We had to go and first of all prove paternity. And then we had to prove that the connection between them was strong enough. And we had to go to one court, and then we had to appeal and then reappeal and go to the district court, back and forth. And finally, actually just before COVID hit, in March of 2020, that they were reunited. And that for me was really a lovely case. But I could go on and tell cases forever, so that's it.
And this particular gentleman was a convert. So perhaps you can talk a little bit more generally about how the conversion issues become so relevant.
As I started saying, with the massive influx of FSU, former Soviet Union immigrants between 1990 and 2000, there were over 1 million people who came into the country. But the law of return doesn't limit the number of people. That doesn't limit the people coming into the country only to those who are Jews. The law of return since 1970 says a Jew can come into the country, a child of a Jew, a grandchild of a Jew, and the spouses of all of the above. So out of the 1 million people who came into Israel, 1/4 of them, 250,000, were not actually halakhically Jewish or weren't Jewish at all. And at that time, Israel had ID cards. Everybody has to have an ID card in Israel. And on your ID card, your nationality or religion is registered. So these people were coming in, many of whom were branded as Jews in the former Soviet Union, because in the former Soviet Union, generally your nationality or religion was determined by your father. And they came into Israel, and they were actually discriminated against because they were considered not Jewish, because they weren't halakhically Jewish. And so on their ID cards, they were registered as Russian, Ukrainian, anything but Jewish. And these are all people who were grown up in secular families, because in the former Soviet Union there wasn't any, you weren't allowed to practice your Judaism. And at that time, the only option was the state Orthodox conversion system, which demanded that if you converted to Judaism, first of all, you had to become completely Orthodox. Secondly, your children had to go to Orthodox schools. And many of these new immigrants, this just didn't speak to them at all. They weren't interested. And slowly but surely, the non-Orthodox movement said, well, come to us and we'll do a user-friendly conversion that takes into account the fact that you're all, those who are children or grandchildren of Jews should be given an easier process, and those who are connected should be given a process that allows men and women to sit together and sending their children to a regular school. But the problem was that conversion wasn't recognized. And so basically from 1993, I made Aliyah in 89 and started working in 1991. In 1993, we started the conversion battle to recognize non-Orthodox conversion performed in Israel at the time, not even for the purpose of making Aliyah, because these people had already made Aliyah, but for allowing them to be registered as Jewish in the population registry. And because of the Orthodox monopoly in Israel, this was a political and legal hot potato. The Supreme Court really didn't want to deal with it, but the reason why the Supreme Court could deal with it and had to deal with it was because, unlike marriage and divorce, there is no law governing conversion in Israel. There is no law that says who is a convert in Israel. What there is the law of return that says a person who is Jewish if they were born to a Jewish mother or were converted. And it doesn't say how does one determine or how does one interpret who was a convert. And without any legislation, the only way you can do that is through the Supreme Court. So we started petitioning the Supreme Court in 1993. And the first decision was handed down in 1995. And what they basically said was, we determined that there is no monopoly over conversion, so that state conversion is not the only way. But we're not yet prepared to say that non-Orthodox Judaism is the way to go. So try and persuade the Interior Ministry to recognize your conversions in a more particular case. That was 93. In 95, we served more petitions. In 2002, we got a Supreme Court ruling that said, we're not going to deal with Aliyah. We're not going to deal with the question of if a person can make Aliyah on the basis of conversion, but we will say that for the purpose of registration in your ID cards, we can't see any reason why conversion shouldn't be recognized by non-Orthodox streams as well, because Israel is a state, finally they said it, Israel is a state of all Jews from all backgrounds. Israel isn't just an Orthodox Jewish state. It is a state that recognizes the multiplicity of streams of Judaism. And when we're talking about the registration, which is a symbolic act and doesn't give anything apart from your registration in your ID card, we think that there should be no difference between Orthodox and non-Orthodox conversions. And so in 2002, the Supreme Court said from now on, a person who is converted non-Orthodox can be registered as Jewish, which meant a lot to the former Soviet Union new immigrants because that's what they were interested in. However, at that point in time, in fact, even until today, but at that point in time, the Minister of the Interior was from the Shas religious party, who said, over my dead body, there is no way that I'm going to accept that a non-Orthodox Jew will be recognized as such on their ID card. And so he ordered for the registration of nationality to be scrapped from people's ID cards. So from 2002, no longer can you be branded Russian, Ukrainian, Jewish, Arab. He knocked it all off. So in fact, I can be blamed for the fact that no one is no longer discriminated on their ID cards because he knocked it off for everybody. But what he didn't realize was that he could knock it off the ID cards. He couldn't knock it off the registration in the population registry. But even so, there was still a feeling that it doesn't really mean anything. So long as the conversion doesn't give anything more than this registration, it's not there. You're not there yet. And many of the population in Israel and out of Israel even said, well, if it doesn't mean anything, why should we do it? Because we can't gain anything from it. So the next stage was to try and breach the gap by having people study in Israel but convert abroad. Because up until that time, there was a sort of a general feeling that the politics regarding conversion in Israel didn't spread outside of Israel. And because there was a very strong understanding that Israel doesn't have a right to interfere and to judge what's happening outside of Israel, conversions performed in all streams of Judaism outside of Israel should be recognized. Again, it was never stated clearly, but that's what was happening in practice. So we felt that, okay, let's get these people to study in Israel, and then they can convert overseas and we'll see what happens. Now, we're talking about 2002, 2003, at a time when more and more people were coming to Israel and settling either as former foreign workers or as spouses of Israelis who couldn't get automatic citizenship. So these were people who weren't citizens and they didn't have an automatic right to citizenship. Under the state of Israel, nobody who is not entitled under the law of return can get automatic citizenship. It's not like Australia or the States that if you live in Israel for a certain number of years, you can then be eligible for citizenship. There is no right for citizenship if you're not eligible under law of return. So these people who are either spouses of Israelis or were here on humanitarian grounds, refugees who had got some sort of status in Israel and wanted to convert to Judaism, if they converted non-Orthodox, they weren't given any status. And of course, getting status was ultimately very, very important so they could get citizenship. So we were teaching them in Israel and then sent them overseas to convert. And the Interior Ministry argued that that was a fictitious conversion overseas because they were actually studying in Israel. But the Supreme Court, again, it took a while, but in 2005 said, no. What counts is the fact that they were converted overseas, and we are making a definitive statement that anyone who is converted overseas in non-Orthodox congregations, Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative, will be registered will be recognized for the purposes of making Aliyah. So that was the first time that the Supreme Court had come out and said anyone who's converted outside of Israel can make Aliyah. But it still left, the last step was what happens if you convert in Israel. And again, the Supreme Court didn't want to deal with it. They kept saying, this is an issue that we don't want to take responsibility for. If you don't like, the Interior Ministry, don't like the way we're going, then do something about it. And the way to do something about it is to legislate. And we were always very, very worried that if it comes to legislation, with the political situation as it were at the time, that we would lose that sort of battle. So we in 2005 served, by the way, it wasn't 4, it was 12 petitions to the Supreme Court. And these were all people who'd come to me and said, we want to convert, we're prepared to take the ride with you. And it wasn't an easy ride because these people weren't guaranteed anything. They weren't citizens. I didn't know whether we were going to win, and if we would lose, the Interior Ministry could just kick him out of the country. And they said, we're putting our faith in you and in the Reform and Conservative movements. We're going to go this journey with you. And we served the petitions in 2005. And the Supreme Court had a hearing in 2006. And then I went to Australia, actually. And then what happened was basically nothing happened while I was in Australia for 2.5 years. But what did happen was that the Knesset did try and pass a law. What the Knesset tried to do was make a very simple law which says marriage and divorce performed in Israel have to be governed by the rabbinate, which was one of Ben-Gurion's most serious mistakes, if you ask me, in 1962, when he gave all authority for marriage and divorce to the Orthodox monopoly. They tried to say marriage and divorce and conversion. That was really easy. They wanted to add 2 words to the law. And we were very, very lucky that they tried to do this at a time when Obama was in power, when the non-Orthodox movements outside of Israel were strong, and Netanyahu was very interested in keeping everybody on side. And basically the Jewish world stood up and said, if you let this law pass, we're going to stop our support for Israel. And he backed down. And then they tried to make other compromises throughout the years. Let's form this commission and that commission. In the meantime, these people are still staying with us with no status. We had one of my favorite clients had breast cancer. She had no medical coverage, and she still didn't give up. And she said, no, my conversion with the Reform movement is a real conversion. I feel Jewish. I'm going to fight the entire way. And then came 2017, or actually came 2016. 2016 was another landmark decision for an Orthodox conversion performed in Israel. Now, the Supreme Court was very smart. They knew that the political backlash would be smaller if they made a decision about an Orthodox conversion, because how could the Orthodox in Parliament object to an Orthodox conversion being performed, even if it was performed privately? And this was a conversion performed by a Haredi rabbi sitting in Bnei Brak. But what they did was they basically used all our arguments. We sat there on the side, sort of giving all the arguments across, but it wasn't our case. And the Supreme Court in 2016 came down and said, any conversion, the same rule that we applied for overseas, any conversion performed in a recognized Jewish community around the world that should be recognized for the purpose of conversion should be recognized. And the same rule should apply in Israel if there's no legislation. So this Haredi rabbi in Bnei Brak was a very well-known rabbi, and they said, well, he's a recognized Jewish community, same as Reform conservative movements overseas. We'll recognize his conversion for the purpose of the law of return. Now, anyone who had their ears open and their eyes open would have known that the next step would be, therefore, the same logic should apply for non-Orthodox conversions. And so in 2017, they tried to pass another law because they knew what was coming. They knew that if this case was passed, our case would be next in line. It had to be next in line. We'd been waiting since 2005. And in 2017, they tried again. And again, they made a tactical error. They tried to pass this law at the time when the World Zionist Congress was having its sessions in Israel, and the World Zionist Congress is governed, or was at that time, with many, many non-Orthodox Jews. And so they tried to pass this law while they were here, and they just all went to Netanyahu and said, forget it, mate, it's just not going to happen. And they backed down. Part of the reason they backed down actually was partially because of the Zionist Congress, but the other reason was because there is so much infighting between the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox. They couldn't agree on the wording of the law. The ultra-Orthodox wanted the conversion issue to be governed by the ultra-Orthodox, and the Orthodox wanted it for them to have some flexibility into what decisions should be made. And actually, we were sitting there on the side thinking, keep fighting. It's good for us. And the law fell. And then we said to the Supreme Court, okay, enough is enough is enough. They're not managing to pass a law. We have people sitting here now. The number that was 12 that started had now become 50 because there were people throughout the years that had been joining. And the Supreme Court said to the state, we're giving you 6 months. 6 months went past and the state came back and said, we've got elections. Give us another 6 months. 6 months went past. We've got more elections. As you know, we had 4 elections over the last 2 years. And finally, in July 2020, the state said, give us another 6 months because we now have COVID and we can't meet and we can't make any decisions. And the Supreme Court said, we're going to give you 6 months. That's it, no longer. Come December 2020, the state asked again for another 6 months. And this time the Supreme Court said, no, we're not giving you any more time. But they wouldn't say when they were going to hand down the decision. And the elections were set down for the 23rd of March, and January went by, February went by, and we were feeling that there is no way they're going to hand down a decision so close to the elections because it will have such a strong backlash. And on the 1st of March, I was actually in the Interior Ministry in Jerusalem, helping a client who converted in Brazil, trying to get citizenship because the Interior Ministry didn't like the fact that there was a conservative rabbi in Brazil who was converting. And I'm sitting there and I got an SMS to my phone saying, Nikki, get back to the office. We're getting a decision in half an hour. Because in Israel, they don't invite you anymore to hear when the decision's being handed down. They just let you know it's going on the internet within half an hour. So I raced back to the office on the 1st of March, and then shit hit the fan, and we won. And it really was an amazing, not only feeling that all this fighting that we've been doing for 30 years had finally achieved fruition, but this time we had made a real difference, not only to the 50 people who we converted who are now eligible to make Aliyah and to get citizenship, but so many of the former Soviet Union people and Israeli citizens all of a sudden said, wow, now you have arrived. Now the reform and conservative movements are recognized for more than just something that's symbolic, for something that gives something that's serious. Citizenship is the most serious thing that you can actually give to someone. And they've been coming out like woodwork. And we're seeing now, well, about probably hundreds per week of people calling and saying, we want to convert with you. We want to be part of Israeli society, be recognized by Jews, and we want to be recognized as Jews through your movements because your movement is what speaks to us. And so I sort of feel that, in coming full circle, in the sense that, I made Aliyah for numerous reasons, but one of them was to try and make Israel a better place, and also to try and make Israel a more pluralistic society. And the conversion decision has really helped do that.
There's this great ripple effect in Israel. Has it got a ripple effect for converts who are converting outside Israel?
What's happening is people who up until now have always converted outside of Israel have said, can we convert in Israel?
Right.
And the answer is you can, but you still can convert outside of Israel. Mm-hmm. So I would still recommend, if somebody lives outside of Israel, it's still going to be easier to convert outside of Israel because there's a lot of politics involved. But basically there is now no real difference between converting outside of Israel and converting inside of Israel.
You mentioned Uri Regev, who at that time invited you into the job that you're still doing. And Uri was quoted in the Jerusalem Post shortly after the decision came down as having a great fear that the Knesset would castrate the Supreme Court decision. A very beautiful word picture. Is Uri right in his worry?
Yes and no. All right. The Supreme Court has been under attack, not just because of the conversion issue. It's been under attack for basically since Netanyahu has been indicted, or even Netanyahu was about to be indicted. And he knew that the way to, he assumed that one of the ways to help his case would be to make the Supreme Court weaker. And so there've been never-ending attacks on the Supreme Court. One of the attacks being the threat of passing a law that says any decision of the Supreme Court that has constitutional effect can be overturned by the Knesset. In Israel, there's no constitution. All right, there is the Supreme Court is not protected by law. So the Supreme Court from 1995 onwards, more or less, has taken on itself constitutional powers. The Supreme Court has said that if the Knesset passes a law that is non-constitutional in the Supreme Court's view of what should be constitutional, i.e., supporting civil rights and supporting the concepts of democracy, or Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, then the Supreme Court has the power to overturn that law. Okay? What the Knesset was trying, or Netanyahu was trying to do, was to curtail that power and say that if the Supreme Court makes a decision that a law is non-constitutional, that decision has to then be approved by the Knesset, basically saying you don't have the right to interfere with any constitutional matters. And of course, that would be a terrible dent into Israel's democracy and into the power of the Supreme Court. And it hasn't got passed. That being said, the decision regarding conversion wasn't affecting a legislative. The Supreme Court wasn't saying I'm overruling a legislative act. The Supreme Court was saying in the face of the fact that there is no legislation, we're filling in the gap and we're interpreting the word convert to include non-Orthodox conversions. Therefore, the Knesset still can today, tomorrow, in theory, pass a law that determines who is a convert, and it will say a convert is an Orthodox convert only. Do I fear that will happen? Well, first of all, we've got to get a Knesset up and running, which we could have 5th elections before that happens. We now have our first non-Orthodox rabbi who is a member of Knesset, Gilad Kariv, who was the head of the Reform movement, is now in Knesset. And our feeling is that, first of all, Netanyahu won't be able to form a government. If a government is formed by a coalition of the central, left, centre and right-wing parties, first of all, conversion will not be the main issue on the agenda. There are so many other things on the agenda, like passing the budget and whatever, and that even if it does come up, the issue, even if it is in the coalition agreements, the chances that they manage to pass a law will be pretty small. So at least all those who've converted up until now will be fine. That's why people are racing to get converted now before a law can be passed. But I don't actually see a law passing in the near future. I think that between 2005 and 2020, a law wasn't passed. They had every opportunity, especially when Trump was in power. They could have passed the law 10 times over, and they didn't. I don't think it's going to happen now, even though they made a big noise about it when the judgment came out.
Well, the other big issue that Uri keeps talking about is allowing Jewish people to marry in Israel without having to choose an ultra-Orthodox rabbi. Is that going somewhere?
As I mentioned before, marriage as opposed to conversion is stuck in legislation. So in 1962, this law was passed that said marriage and divorce between Jews in Israel shall be according to Jewish law as interpreted by the rabbinate. The only way to change that is to pass another law. The Supreme Court doesn't have the power to say that law is non-constitutional because it was passed before they got their non-constitutional powers. So the chances that we manage to pass a law that says that either there'll be civil marriage or that there is the monopoly to the rabbinate for Jewish weddings will be broken, I think is a long way off. Mm-hmm. That being said, what may well happen is that there will be an institutionalization of de facto couples. So more and more couples now are choosing not to get married so that the rabbinate can't influence their lives. And there are also couples who can't get married to the rabbinate because their Judaism isn't recognized by the rabbinate. For example, if you make Aliyah as a Reform convert, you can't get married in the rabbinate. If you're born to a Jewish father, you can't get married by the rabbinate. And so there is a large body of people who either can't get married by the rabbinate or don't want to because they don't want to be forced into the system of a non-equal marriage or the divorce process going through the rabbinate. And there has been a law passed that is called the civil union law, which says you can register your union or your partnership and basically have all the same rights and obligations as a married couple, but just not be registered as married. At the moment, that only applies to people who cannot get married in the rabbinate. And it also applies only to men and women. It doesn't apply to single-sex couples. Just before this last election, the Ministry of Justice passed a suggested change to that law, which would include everybody, which would include single-sex couples, which would include Jewish couples who don't want to get married in the rabbinate. And I think that has a much bigger chance of passing. Mm-hmm. The fact that if that gets passed and you can register your union and have all basically the same rights as a couple who's married, then the Orthodox monopoly on the rabbinate will stop having nearly as much influence. And
so that will mean that you can have your chuppah
that's right.
at Beit Daniel and then just register as a civil union.
That's right. And I think that's the way things. If a government is formed that is formed by the centralist parties, and you've got Lieberman and Saar and all those people who are quite secular in their outlook, there's quite a good chance that will go through.
Well, that would be almost revolutionary.
Yeah.
And that's the thing the ultra-Orthodox would no doubt most fear.
That's right.
Fair enough.
But they don't like us either. So.
Fair enough. Now, the other issue that we talked about a little bit earlier privately that I'll share with everyone is a question relating to adoption and couples who can't have children and wish to adopt. And that's also faced government interference. Would you like to tell a little bit about that?
By the way, the adoption petition that we served was served even before the conversion one.
Goodness.
Our adoption petition, and I'll explain why, was served in 2003.
Goodness.
So that's actually the longest case sitting on the law books at the moment. In Israel, if you want to adopt a child, you can only adopt a child if that child is of the same religion as you are. Okay, you cannot. So a Jewish parent cannot adopt a Muslim child or a Christian child, and the only way you can adopt that sort of child is if that child is converted. Now, the state adoption authority will only recommend a couple to adopt a non-Jewish child if that couple can convert the child Orthodox, because up until now, only Orthodox conversion was recognized. And they would not recommend any couple who was secular because a secular couple wouldn't pass the ultra-Orthodox test of being able to raise their child as Orthodox. And that's why we petitioned in 2003. And we said in 2003, hey, but there's other forms of conversion that can be taken place. And the Supreme Court at the time said, until we decide that your conversion is worth something more than just being registered, we won't make a decision as to whether it's in the child's interest to be converted non-Orthodox as well as Orthodox. So when we won our petition just now, we've just now gone back to the Supreme Court and said, hey, wake up, guys. Now our conversion has been recognized for the purpose of status of citizenship. There is no reason in the world now why you can't make a decision on the adoption case and decide that anyone who can either have a child is capable of converting their child non-Orthodox and Orthodox should be able to adopt a non-Jewish child. The state attorney is fighting that with as much as it can. They just served a petition and a response to the court saying, we think the whole case should be withdrawn because it's too old. It's been sitting in the court for too long, so we think the facts have changed, so it should be withdrawn. But the Supreme Court hopefully will actually now make a decision and change that inequality as well, and basically make the decision that's been begging to be made. And that is, if we live in a Jewish democratic state where there is freedom of religion and freedom of choice, a parent should be able to convert a child the way they choose, and the state should allow that to happen.
And will a same-sex couple be allowed to adopt if they're both Jewish?
That needs a law to be passed, because the adoption law says that a man and a woman.
Right.
They're trying to change it, and there actually have been a lot of drafts going through. I think it's even passed the first reading. Up until now, again, it's got stuck because the balance of power in the Knesset up until now have been the Haredi parties who have said over their dead bodies. If that changes, then that may change. Yeah. So what's happening is single-sex couples, what they're doing is they're either adopting overseas, or many more of them are actually doing surrogacy. There are hundreds and hundreds of single-sex couples who are doing using surrogates in the States now, and they used to be all around the world, but now it's the States. And then they come to us and say, we want to convert your children in the States, non-Orthodox, because of course a single-sex couple cannot convert a child Orthodox in Israel, because that is treif and no good and nothing. The ultra-Orthodox won't convert them. And our conversions are now recognized for all intents and purposes apart from marriage. And so they come to us and ask us to convert them. So we've been doing a lot of conversions of children who have been born by surrogate.
So the Reform Movement and LACO are going to be very, very busy.
Why do you think I went into quarantine?
Well, friends, I think we've had a treat. There is a roving microphone if anyone wishes to raise a question or a comment, which I'm very happy to open to the floor. Pop your hand up and Oliver will hand you a microphone. There's a gentleman at the front. The only reason I'm asking you to please wait for the microphone, because then we are able to record it. And for those who are not able to be here tonight, there will be a YouTube version of this evening's event made public also. Rabbi, there's a gentleman at the front.
Who and how appoints judges to the Supreme Court?
The Supreme Court judges are appointed by a committee that's set up. It's a committee that's been set up by law that includes 3 Supreme Court judges, 2 members of Knesset, 2 members of 2 ministers, and 2 members of the Israeli Bar Association. So it's a half political, well, the politicians have less than 50% of power in the committee. It's more a professional body rather than a political body. And that's another one of the ways that Netanyahu was trying to affect the Supreme Court, by changing the law that says who can appoint Supreme Court judges, by instead of having 3-2-2-2, having 3 Supreme Court judges, 3 members of Knesset, and 3 ministers, which would then change the power of who can be elected. And they haven't managed to get that through. That was actually one of the things that Gantz managed to stop, literally lay on the line and said, I'm not letting that go through. But so at the moment, the Supreme Court is still more of a professional appointment than a political one. But it's very, very tenuous at the moment.
I saw a hand over there and one over here, so we'll just go in order.
Thank you. Great talk. And it's very personal for me as well. So one of the comments from the ultra-Orthodox parties I have read is that not only in the next government, if they are part of government, would they want to make a law that the converts in Israel of the non-Orthodox streams would be not recognized as Jewish, but they would like to extend it to also the converts that were converted outside of Israel. So basically they want to turn the clock back. is there any chance of that happening? That's my first question. And the second question is about surrogacy. So my partner and I are in the process of surrogacy at this moment. We are lucky to have now embryos of a Jewish egg donor. Does it matter anything to the Orthodox establishment of having a Jewish egg donor or a Jewish surrogate? You know, it becomes very technical, but it's quite important for us. Also, we've got friends, for example, here in Sydney who have a Jewish egg donor and a non-Jewish surrogate. They both are halachically Jewish, and the Beit Din here recognized their kids as halachically Jewish. And so that I think that was quite something. Now, another couple that I know, in the same situation, but one of them was not halachically Jewish and one is not Jewish and one is halachically Jewish, is that no, because you're both not both Jewish, so we won't consider it.
So the first question regarding non-Orthodox conversion performed outside of Israel, that's basically never been on the table. I don't know who told you that it was. The draft of the conversion law that's floating around specifically says that conversion performed outside of Israel will be recognized for the law of return regardless. So that was always off the table. I think that was like the line that they threw. They thought that if they do that, then Jewry outside of Israel won't then interfere in what they're trying to do within Israel. But so that's always been off the table. In terms of the whole question of what comes first, the surrogacy, the egg, etc., it's a really complex one. In Israel, as of today, the only thing that counts is a surrogate. They don't take into account biology. So that if the surrogate isn't Jewish, then the child won't be recognized as Jewish, even if the donor may well have been Jewish. And even if the surrogate is Jewish, you'd have to prove that she's Jewish. And it's not always that easy to prove. But if the surrogate proved that she was Jewish, you could probably register the child as Jewish without having to do a conversion.
Just interested in the processes with the Supreme Court. How many judges, and then from your discussion of the situation that has happened over the years, decades, essentially I get the impression that you present a case to the Supreme Court and then you have to wait. They sit in session all alone quietly for however long they decide, and then there's no further debate or discussion with regards to the petition that's been presented, and eventually a decision may or may not be made. Is that the way it happens?
Almost. It's not quite like that. There are 13 judges who are on the Supreme Court. Generally, the bench is 3, 5, 7, or 9. Very, very occasionally, it's 11. So the ordinary bench is 3. All right. So, for example, the case of the adoption is set down before 3 judges. The conversion issue has always been an extended bench. The case in 2002 was 11 judges. This one was 9 judges. So we won. In fact, we got a majority of 8 against 1 in this case. And the one that was dissenting judge was a right-wing appointee. But even he said that legally, there should be no reason to disqualify non-Orthodox conversions. He just wanted to give the state an extra year to try and pass a law. But so what happens is that you have a first hearing generally, and the Supreme Court then decides if there's a case to answer. If there is a case to answer, they make that first decision saying there is a case to answer. Then there is a second hearing that takes place. And if too many years go past between that second hearing, they may have a third hearing, and then it goes to them to make a decision. What happened in our case was a very, very unusual matter when we had our last hearing in 2017, and the state attorney begged the Supreme Court not to hand down a decision. So that generally doesn't happen. You don't really the parties don't have the authority to tell the Supreme Court not to hand down a decision. But they kept doing that. They kept saying, please don't give a decision, please don't give a decision, because we're trying to pass a law, because we're trying to reach a compromise, because there's uncertainty in terms of the legal system, blah, 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 blah. And the Supreme Court let that happen basically for 3 years. And then they finally said, we're going to decide when we're going to hand down a decision, no more. But
coming back to the pre-current decision, when thousands and thousands of people came to Israel, mostly from Russia and those countries in Eastern Europe, how the government dealt with them in terms of their children? Were they able to get to the army? Were they able to serve in the army? And what happened in terms of, occupations? Because you have to show that you served in the army to get any good position. And what was the position then and what it will be now?
Anyone who came into Israel under the law of return, whether they were registered as Jewish or not, they could have actually been Muslim, because you had people come in from Kazakhstan who were born from a Jewish grandfather, but their father was Muslim and they themselves are Muslim. Anyone who came under the law of return is mandated to serve in the army. There are no exemptions. Then it doesn't matter whether you're Jewish or not Jewish. And so they were given all the rights and obligations of anyone who served in the army. And once they scrapped the registration of the ID card, it made their life a little bit easier. Still meant that if a soldier died in battle and they weren't Jewish, there was a problem with burial. And that's still an issue, although it's getting a little bit better now, because there are now more civil burial sites, and also the army has said we're not going to distinguish between soldier and soldier, even though that was against the army. The army rabbis didn't want that to happen, but the cemeteries aren't run by the rabbinate. They're actually run by organizations, so they actually had a little bit more freedom. So if you make Aliyah and you're an Israeli citizen, you have to serve in the army. So whether you're Jewish or not, my boys are both Jewish, but they also finished serving in the army, and my daughter's going to serve in the army. So, yeah.
We have time for one more question.
I just want to ask you, you've referred often to they as the people that we often find ourselves in battle with. And I know that just like when we refer to Arabs, they're not a monolithic. It's more complex than that. When you talk about the Orthodox, there's a wide church of Orthodox. So who are we referring to, and are they united?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for the question. I'm talking about the Interior Ministry officials and actually the State Attorney. So the Interior Ministry's position, the head of the Interior Ministry being somebody from the Shas party, was that they would do anything basically not to recognize non-Orthodox conversions. The state attorney who represents the Interior Ministry was also representing the government position or Netanyahu's position. Again, I think that Netanyahu's position changed over the last few years because of his dependence on the ultra-Orthodox. I'm not talking about they as in the society in general. I'm talking specifically about the Interior Ministry, which is the body that governs all questions that deal with the law of return.
Well, friends, I think you've gathered that the State of Israel, and indeed our progressive movement, is at an important crossroad in history. And we've had the benefit of hearing it from the Nikki's mouth.
Thanks.
Thank you. But LACO, where Nikki works, is funded very largely by communities such as ours. There are no Israeli government funds that go into it. And it's with the investment this community has been making that Nikki and her colleagues are able to do their work. In addition, there are now approximately 150 active Reform and Conservative congregations in Israel. As of 2 years ago, 13% of Israelis identified with the progressive Jewish movements, which is interestingly the same percentage as self-identify as ultra-Orthodox. And as Nikki has indicated tonight, our figures are likely to grow. The pandemic brought Israelis to an important representation. And that was only 21st century progressive Judaism allowed people to practice their Judaism when they were in lockdown.
Okay.
And for the first time ever, as Nikki mentioned, Gilad Kariv, who many of you will recall spoke to us just a few years ago, is now a member of the Knesset, elected on the Labor Party slate. These are all events that will help confirm Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. And the opposition of the Haredi parties is to be expected. That funding that we have also helps many people obtain benefits through our Keren B'Kavod program for social justice, attend summer camps, become part of the fabric of Israeli youth, attend gap year programs at a progressive Mechina in Jaffa and help the local Arab community, to provide the legal aid that Nikki and her team provide, and to fight for their rights to sit where they want on a bus or an aeroplane, to be married or civilly unified, and to remove offensive modesty signs on the street. It enables men and women to achieve gender equality in Israel. That's what we're investing in, and that's an important investment. We also need to recognise that COVID-19 in fact hit Israelis much harder than here in Australia. The rate of impact was significant until the vaccination program got moving. Let me share with you one story. It's a lady called Nicole, who's a single mother. She was a new immigrant from Ethiopia, recently divorced from an alcoholic husband. The husband no longer has contact with her children. She's employed in the menial task of washing elderly people in an old age home. She's often forced to leave her 4-year-old daughter under the care of the 10-year-old son with no one else at home. She can't afford help. Purim this year, Aniko had no means to buy her children Purim costumes, which they very much wanted. And they were caught out in the lockdown. After hearing of that disappointment, our movement social justice team surprised her children by providing 2 costumes, which happened to be Spider-Man and Elsa, and put them at the bottom of a crate where we delivered food for the family to get through the week. So Aniko and her children not only had fresh food, but through the progressive movement were able to celebrate Purim during COVID.
And had legal assistance at the same time.
There you go. For the last 2 years, for the first time, 100 cents in the dollar that you contribute through the UIA Refugee Relief Fund goes straight through to the progressive movements projects. These are the projects that we've spoken about. These are the projects you've heard firsthand about. And I was very pleased to report that when Nikki spoke to a group in Melbourne last week, a number of those attending had already made their contributions to Progressive Appeal and actually made a second contribution. So you were pretty darn effective in Melbourne. Please do give generously. This year, Karen and I have increased our contribution 10% because we can see the need, we can see the importance, and we know that right now the progressive movement is at a crossroads and is able to achieve so much for so many people. My colleagues will be giving you pledge cards, which we ask you to please fill in and hand in before you leave. It does not matter how much you contribute. That amount which you feel is a generous contribution, we will say a very warm thank you. It's the only way that the work of Nikki and her team can continue, and that is why the Union for Progressive Judaism holds the UI Progressive Appeal every year. Thank you very much for coming. Please complete your pledge cards. Oliver will share with you while you're doing that another beautiful piece coming to you from Beit Daniel in Jerusalem while you do so, and there are tea and cookies available at the front. Thank you very much for joining.